Hi, everyone, and welcome here on this really beautiful day to New York Live Arts. My name is Carla Peterson. I'm the artistic director, and it's lovely to be able to have you here for the third event today, third panel discussion, and which will be part of a total of 21 events that will take place over the course of the next 5 days. Quite a compressed and exciting and lushly diverse group of things that include films, panel discussions, and live performance, including dance, theater, and music. And that explore the topics that the worlds of Oliver Sacks looks at through all of his works. And it's my great pleasure today then to introduce to you the moderator of this next panel, Jeffrey Kittay.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm going to introduce the three panelists, and then we can start the discussion. The first one is Ani Patel, Associate Professor of the Department of Psychology of Tufts. Ani studies the cognitive neuroscience of music. He's also, as I understand, a mean guitarist, so that's important too. The second panelist, Joseph Ledoux, was unable to make it, but we have a colleague of his, colleague both in terms of doing research together and part of the band, the Amygdalas, that Joseph and Daniela are both part of. It's Daniela Schiller. She's a professor of psychiatry and neuroscience at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, and she studies emotional memory in the brain. And finally, Connie Tomeno, who's co-founder with Oliver and executive director of the Institute for Music and Neurologic Function. She's worked with Oliver on all things musical and is one of the dedicatees of the book Musicophilia. This is Connie Tomeno. So I invite you to be seated. Yes. I'm going to give the briefest of introductions. Before 1980, there was really very little to say about music in the brain. We couldn't do much research at all about that. But for reasons you all know now, suddenly that area is open for rigorous study. And before then, and until recently, most discussions about music would be about the history of music. It would be about the aesthetics of music, the anthropology of music, maybe, and musicology would be the most semi-rigorous way of looking at music in terms of the formal elements of the musical composition. Suddenly now we've got an amazing amount of new information coming from new tools and the ability to try to apply that information therapeutically. What is it all? Does it cohere? That's what we're going to discuss, and I, for one, am going to learn a lot this afternoon. So let's get started. We have a rough plan of 10 minutes introduction and some exposition from each panelist. Then we're going to go around with a 5-minute reaction to what's been previously said, which should leave 25 or 30 minutes at the end for you and I to ask questions or make comments. We'll try to stick semi-rigorously to this, so that there'll be enough time at the end. So I hand the podium, such as it is, over to Ani.
Thank you. I think I'll stand. So I just want to begin by talking a little bit about Oliver's role in the nascent field of music neuroscience. 15 or 16 years ago, when I was finishing up my PhD studying music and the brain in a biology department, which was a totally bizarre thing to be doing, I could never have imagined that we would have such a flourishing of research on music in the brain as we've seen in the last decade, where there are now international conferences, many papers being published in prestigious journals, and so forth. It's an exciting young area, and Oliver's played a really important role. to make it sort of a personal story, he basically acted as a mentor for many of us, I think. When I was in grad school studying this weird subject in a biology department, you know, I was looking for people to turn to for encouragement. And one of the people I turned to was this neurologist named Oliver Sacks, who's one of his books I'd read. And I'd wrote him this letter about music and aphasia based on some things I think you've probably done with Connie that I'd read about, with some ideas about what might be going on, why could aphasics sometimes still sing when they couldn't speak and so forth, never expecting to really hear back from somebody of that eminence. And then I got this beautiful 2-page handwritten letter back, you know, enthusiastic, engaged, open. And that encouragement came at a really important time for me. And I subsequently learned that he'd been sort of in contact with a lot of young people that were in this field that didn't even know it was a field yet. And then we came together, and subsequently, Oliver and I wrote books at the same time about music in the brain and exchanged manuscripts. And he's really, a lot of the people in the field have been influenced by him. And he's brought this world of music in the brain to so many people's attention. And that's helping our field grow. So thank you, Connie and Oliver, for making that happen. It's a wonderful legacy he's left to this field of music in the brain. So today I want to talk a little bit about some research in this area, using some slides to give you a feel for some of the work that's been happening that has some intersections with music therapy. So if we could start, Matt. So as Jeff mentioned, one of the reasons this is an exciting time for the study of music in the brain, we had Oliver's sort of naturalistic observations about the power of music in people's lives in neurological patients. And now we're having this renaissance, or this upwelling of techniques to look at the living brain. This is a little slide. It looks like a piece of abstract art, but what it's meant to display is different brain imaging techniques. You might see functional MRI up on the top, which you could recognize, or PET and so forth. These are different ways of looking at the brain at different time scales and different spatial scales. And all this slide is meant to show is that we now have a wide range of tools for looking at living human brains as they process information, which is all relatively new and opens up a variety of new ways of doing things. For example, you can have somebody playing a piano while they're having their brain scan and see what's going on inside their brain, a remarkable thing that just was unimaginable 15, 20 years ago. Okay, if we could go to the next slide. The other thing that's been crucial, besides, of course, these technologies, which are wonderful, is the growth of research on the basic psychology of music and the cognition of music. And this slide, this image from my colleague Dan Levitin, shows the growth, the rapid growth in the field of music cognition. This is a number of papers published per decade, starting in the 30s and marching up to the 2000s. That last big blue bar is the 2000s. And you can see, I mean, it's remarkable. It looks like the growth of bacteria in a petri dish, right? It's just going up and up and up. And so this is a field that's really engaging students. Classes are heavily subscribed in undergraduate institutions like Tufts, where I teach. And I think we're going to see more and more research. So the combination of the neuroscience tools and the basic psychology and cognition research is really what's exciting about this field. So if we could go on. So one of the big questions that faces the field of music and cognitive neuroscience of music is, why does the human brain respond so strongly to music? It's a question that goes back to Plato and the early Indian philosophers and beyond. And well, you might say music has an unparalleled ability to touch our emotions and to activate physical motion, and that's certainly true. You could go on there. And it does this starting early in life. And I want to show you a little movie that I love that illustrates this. And then we'll talk about why music has this remarkable effect. And just as you're watching the movie, keep in mind this beautiful painting by Kandinsky that I'm going to talk about briefly. This is a painting made after he attended the first concert of Schoenberg's music in Munich. Okay.
Hi, girls. It's August 6th. Is that right?
Yeah.
August 6th, 2012. Daddy's going to play them a little song while they're eating their peas.
You guys ready?
So that's musicophilia in action, right? And I mean, I think Connie would think, we were talking, these probably are less than one, it seems, right? And why is music having that effect? If you remember the beginning of Musicophilia, Oliver writes about if a Martian came down to Earth and looked at music, they'd be puzzled. You know, this thing doesn't convey any propositions. That's all abstract, just tones. Why is it having this powerful effect on us? So if we could go back to that. one suggestion is because it activates at least 6 different emotional pathways in our brains. Let me just go back and say about the Kandinsky. The reason I mentioned that is, we can create art forms in many ways, abstract art forms. Kandinsky created beautiful abstract art, but if you showed that Kandinsky painting to those 2 little girls, I seriously doubt they're going to have that kind of a reaction, right? Something about music really gets to our bodies and to our emotions. And one recent theory about why it does that is because we don't just have one emotional center in our brains, we have multiple emotional centers and emotional pathways. And we have an expert on emotion who'll be talking about some of this later. But one idea is music activates many of these pathways. For example, this is what's called multiple mechanisms theory. So if we can just go through these, there's the basic raw response to sound through the brainstem. There's implicit associations we have with emotional events that happen during music. There's the sound, the kind of contagion you get when you hear sad-sounding voices that perhaps make you feel sad, or happy-sounding voices that make you feel happy. Some of these same acoustic properties are in instrumental music, and it's thought to affect us that way. Imagery that you get when you listen to music. Go on. Memories that are from your own life, things that were happening that were important to you when you heard certain pieces. And finally, a big area of research is expectancy, tension and response in music, and how it unfolds in time. This is just their little list of 6 separate things that can activate emotions. And I think if you go on, it's a partial list. Go ahead. For example, rhythm and its ability to move the body is certainly something else. But I think the key insight of this idea is on the right track, is that there's no unique pathway for music to reach the emotions in the brain. And none of those pathways is unique to music, but music may be unique in the way it activates all these pathways at once in a way that very little else can. Okay, so I just want to talk you through one study from the recent literature about the effect of music listening on the brain. And in a broader context, if we could just step through this slide, this is an area that's getting more and more research, and future work is going to need to address a few things. One is, how reliable is music as a way of affecting the brain, especially in neurological patients? And you always want to compare music to something else. For example, one reason we so often turn to drugs in Western society is that they reliably work in some cases. And so, can music be like that? How big is the effect? How big is the effect compared to other things? And how does music really have these effects mechanistically? That's what gets scientists excited. So let's walk through a study. This is a study that was done in a large hospital in Finland. So if we can go to the next slide. Published in a good neurology journal called Brain. And they were interested in how music would affect the brain of recovering neurology patients. These were patients that had strokes, 60 patients that had strokes. And they divided them into 3 groups. All had the standard therapy, if you can go on. But the 3 groups differed in one respect. One group got to listen to an hour of music per day that they chose themselves. Another group got to listen to an hour of stories, books on tape, every day that they chose themselves. And then the third group didn't do any extra therapy. And this is for 2 months. And then they were assessed post-stroke on a number of cognitive and mood measures. And then they basically looked to see what effects these had. So they checked them right after their stroke and then after the therapy was over. So the therapy lasted 2 months, and they checked them at 3 months and at 6 months. Let me show you some of the results. So what was neat about this study is they used standardized tests of various psychological and emotional functions. So for example, verbal memory, short-term memory, focused attention, and so forth. And on the emotion side, fatigue, vigor, depression, and so forth. So they were using standardized tests, people who were blinded to the condition that the subjects had been in. Very nicely controlled study. So let's go on and look at some data. So what I want to show you now are some of the results. What did they find? And I'm going to show you this by group. So the dots are the music group. Let's just show that first one. I'll just show that first one at first. And what this shows, the way you read these graphs is, this is showing change from baseline. So that BL is baseline. So that's where they were at the onset. They weren't at 0. That's just whatever score they had is considered to be 0. So you can look at changes from that. And you can see at 3 months and 6 months, after the music therapy is over, it didn't matter which group you belonged to. Whether you listened to music or tapes or didn't do anything special, your visual spatial cognition recovered after your stroke. Okay, fine. So that's how most of the tests looked. But on a couple of tests, it did make a difference what group you were in. And in those tests, the music group did the best. So let's look at that data. So in terms of verbal memory, your ability to recall words that have just been said to you, the music group in the dashed line with the circles is doing better significantly than the other groups, and one more. And in terms of focused attention, the music group is doing better than the other groups, okay? Both the story group and the no control, no extra treatment. All right, let's go on to the emotional and mood measures. Again, for most measures, it didn't matter what group you belonged to. For example, the amount of fatigue you reported at 3 months and 6 months didn't matter if you listened to music or stories or nothing else. But for 2 measures, it made a difference, and again, music did better than any other group. So let's look at those. So depression was less. Now, better is down on a depression scale. So depression was less in the music group, and confusion was less in the music group, okay? So this is a nicely controlled study that's showing simply listening to an hour of self-selected music per day after a stroke for a couple of months is having measurable and significant effects on cognitive and emotional measures of behavior. So let's go on. So as I mentioned, studies like this raise a bunch of interesting issues that are just beginning to be researched. There's the reliability. Can we replicate this? How would it compare to giving them a drug, say? The effect size. How much benefit do you get for how much cost? The comparator, and this is a really interesting one, and I think one that Connie and I might talk about, is this is just recorded music. This is just listening to music over headphones. There's a whole field of music therapy that's developed the art of interaction, human interaction. The brain is a social organ, and it responds hugely strongly to social interaction. So imagine comparing this recorded music to a live music therapist who spent an hour a day with you, who could look you in the eye and engage you and play the songs that you wanted to hear and get you to sing and all these things that you do with part of human interaction. That could be potentially much more efficacious. And then finally, I'll end with a little bit about mechanism, because this is why neuroscientists are interested in this field, because it gives us a chance to think about the mechanisms behind these amazing effects. So let's just look at one idea that's been proposed. So the authors of this paper proposed that basically music induces sort of a positive mood, and that influences cognition. There are rich connections between mood and cognition, emotion and cognition. You might know Damasio's book on this, Descartes' error. And there are deep brain structures like the nucleus accumbens that release reward substances like dopamine, and those project to broad areas of the brain, including the frontal cortex involved in cognition. So that's one idea. But I have a different hypothesis, actually, and if you can just show it, I'll walk you through it. There are certain hormones in your body that are released by stress, and one of them is cortisol. And we know that's very high after stroke. And cortisol, there are brain regions that are very sensitive to cortisol, especially when it's in high concentrations for long periods of time. And these include regions like the frontal cortex, which is involved in attention, which is one of the tasks that people did better on, hippocampus, which is involved in memory, and the amygdala is involved in emotion. And Danielle will tell us a lot about the amygdala. And we note that music can, so I would hypothesize that music and soothing music can lower cortisol levels post-stroke, therefore protecting these regions. It's basically lowering the level of these toxic chemicals that have impacts on these key brain regions involved in cognitive and emotional function. So this is a testable hypothesis, and it's different from what's been proposed, and that's what you want in science. You want competing hypotheses to get people out there testing things empirically. So I think I will probably end there and hand it over to Daniela. Okay?
Thank you. Pardon me?
Questions first?
No questions. We're going to have questions later.
All right. So when you take the brain outside of your skull and put it in a jar, it's pretty ugly. But really, the brain holds tremendous beauty. This is the basic unit of the brain, the neuron. And we have billions of these basic units that communicate together. This is the artist that made this drawing. This is Ramon y Cajal. He is the father of neuroscience. He actually started as an artist, but his father forced him to go to medical school and forced him to be an anatomist. So he just drew whatever he saw. And he drew these beautiful neurons. But that led to the discovery that the brain is not a conjoined network. It's actually separate units that talk together, but they don't touch. And this is what gave him the Nobel Prize. These are novel technologies. Today, we can actually put paint in the brain. We can color the neurons, and we can even shed light, and they will project light. This is the hippocampus. This is a slice through the brain, the area of the brain that is involved in memories. This is a drawing of Jackson Pollock. Actually, no. So it's nice that it took us 100 years to develop these state-of-the-art technologies to show what Ramon y Cajal showed over 100 years ago. These are neurons from the cerebellum. That's a region that is involved in coordination. These are neurons actually also from the cerebellum. These are neurons from the retina, from the portion in your eye that gets the light. And these are neurons from your cortex, the external layers of the brain. They're really nicely organized, like soldiers in different layers. So the way we know that is from animals. But today, we can also do experiments on humans. And what we do is we put them in this MRI machine, and the machine takes pictures over time, so it's like a movie. And what happens is that blood flows through your brain to the particular regions that are active. And if we take pictures over time, we can see which region is active and which not when you perform psychological actions. That's how it looks. So you can look at certain images, and you will see this is the occipital cortex, the visual cortex, that responds to visual stimuli. And we can do all these like fancy, it looks really nice, but it's just the program is doing it all. We can also image just the fibers. These are the fibers that connect neurons throughout the brain, and we can isolate them. And that was actually a beauty competition of pictures of the brain. So the brain gives rise to emotions, and emotions are hardwired in the brain. We know because we don't have to learn. We don't have to learn how to be afraid, but we do learn what to be afraid of. And the way we do it is using a key region, that's the amygdala. So the way to know where the amygdala is take an imaginary line through your eye, an imaginary line through your ear, and when they meet, this is the amygdala. Sometimes I give this example with pencils, and then you never forget where the amygdala is. So consider the following story. This is Tom, and Tom just minds his own business. Then a bear comes along. So what happens is the amygdala lights up and activates widespread networks in the brain that makes Tom run away. Now let's say that for reasons known only to the bear has a bell. So what happens is that Tom first hears the bell, then sees the bear, then the amygdala lights up. So the amygdala is unique in that it converges these types of information from the bell and the bear. They meet in the amygdala, and this is where the memory is formed. That's your fear memory. And what it does, it enters the amygdala, and the amygdala sends projections to areas of the brain, like the brainstem and hypothalamus, that makes your freezing or running response and makes a surge of hormones in your body. The amygdala is widely connected with many, many regions in the brain, so it's like a little amplifier, if you will, such that the next time you see the bell, you're going to remember that it is scary. You're not going to need to see the bear again. So the process I just discovered is Pavlovian conditioning that was discovered by Ivan Pavlov. So you might remember the dog and the bell. The dog actually expected the food already when he heard the bell. So that's how they discovered this association. Actually, it's by mistake because he was actually a physiologist that was interested in the digestive system. So we're pretty lucky about that. So the problem is that these associations are very, very strong. And once they are formed, we never forget them. And when I'm pointing to the bell, actually, this is the point I want you to think about music. Because music, it's not necessarily that particular songs are associated, but maybe they resonate with sounds that were meaningful for us in the past, and they retrieve these overtones and these music that accompanied us way before. So the way memory is formed, this is a classic theory of memory, is the theory of consolidation. And the idea is that memory is formed through a one-time event where it's being consolidated in the brain. What does it mean to be consolidated? These are two neurons. And as I mentioned, the neurons, they don't touch. They keep little gaps that are called synapses. And synapses is where chemicals are kind of swimming in this water that surrounds the neurons. But what happens is that this communication in the synapse can get better and better. So if you learn something and you practice something, these connections become much faster. So it's like switching from regular mail to email. The message is now transferring much faster. This is, you can see the connection from very close. So they don't touch. They still leave a little gap. These are projections from two neurons. So what happens is, as I mentioned, we remember almost forever. And you see how music triggers all these memories. Sometimes we want to get rid of memory, especially when it becomes traumatic. It's not that now we're going to do the eternal sunshine of the spotless mind. It's not about that. We don't want to change memories. Memories are who we are. But sometimes they change who we are because they become intrusive and they affect our everyday and they control us, and we just suffer. This is a disease called post-traumatic stress disorder, and there are various anxiety disorders. So what happens today in therapy is that we do exposure therapy. We learn all sorts of techniques to overcome fear. What we use is the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex sends projections to the amygdala. What does it mean? Is that the region here behind your forehead is communicating with the amygdala. So the amygdala is not just this like one region. It's actually a collection of nuclei, and they speak to each other. And between them, there are these islands of inhibitory neurons. These are the islands that actually, like traffic lights, they direct information. The prefrontal cortex is interesting because it sends projections straight to these islands. And actually, from there, the prefrontal cortex can direct. And it can influence if you're going to have a fear response or not. And the way we learn to activate the prefrontal cortex is through therapy, through techniques of emotion regulation, mindfulness, all that stuff. But then sometimes it's hard, and we have two memories that compete for each other. The question is, can we change the original memory? Can we get rid of fear altogether? So on the top panel, that's the original theory of memory. But the last decade has been incredibly exciting because the last decade changed the way we think of memory. And now we think of memory as much more dynamic. It changes all the time. Because the idea is that the memory is not formed through a one-time process of consolidation. Actually, each time you retrieve it, it has to be consolidated again. What it means is that when you retrieve a memory, it's unstable in your brain. It's vulnerable. So in the laboratory, we can use it. We can retrieve a memory and then hit it with a drug. And the drug can block the storage of the memory. So this happens currently in animal studies, and we're just starting to see if it works in humans, and actually if it works for such strong memories. But it's not that evolution created this window of opportunity for scientists to have fun. Why does memory is vulnerable? Why does it keep changing? One idea is that you retrieve a memory, and you actually can incorporate new information available at the time of retrieval. So that's like, for example, an elephant. Let's say you're a little kid, and it's the first time you saw an elephant. So maybe you remember it was this like gigantic elephant, was the most amazing thing in the world, and you were all excited and afraid. And then think about how you would remember it at the age of 5, 7, 10, 15. The memory is different. Now the elephant is in a different context. You're not that excited now. You actually, so it reminds you other things. This is the rewriting of the memory. Now think what would happen if you wouldn't do this rewriting. So each time you would see an elephant, you would behave as if it's the first time you see an elephant. This is a traumatic memory. This is how the memory is not supposed to work. So actually, we're supposed to rewrite our memory. And we actually do that all the time. But, and probably techniques in therapy are doing that too. But what neuroscience gives is the actual, it's kind of a little bit late because everybody discovered it before, and this is what we do. But now we might know what is the neural mechanism that underlies it. So for example, if we'll take Tom, what we'll do is that instead of, when Tom, we'll have him reactivate the memory of the bear, and then associate it with something nice. Now the bell is associated with something pleasurable, something fun. So the next time Tom will hear a bell, it wouldn't be so scary because we rewrote it with this more pleasant information. And that's it.
So you've heard from two scientists about how possibly music works with the brain and how fears are formed and memories are formed. My work in music therapy has been on how music can be used therapeutically to help people either enhance their function or to maintain the function that they may be losing because of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Also, how music can inform the development of function in early children with different kinds of sensory integration disorders and developmental delays. When I first started my work in music therapy, and it's great to follow Daniela, because my first assignment was in a nursing home where people were in end stages of dementia and pretty much non-responsive to the environment. And this is 1978, so just think about that progression that Ani talked about, how neuroscience has really advanced in the past few years. Well, 1978, imagine a room of people with end-stage dementia who are very agitated, somewhat catatonic, unresponsive, and the music therapist walks in with her guitar. And I'm told by everybody, both the nurses and doctors, don't expect anything because they don't know what's going on. They have no awareness of the environment. They don't know who they are. They can't process anything. And I start singing, "Let Me Call You Sweetheart." And don't you know, and I tell this story all the time because don't you know the people who are agitated calm down? The people who seem to be catatonic and non-responsive started singing the words to the song. And now I'm saying in my head, because my background, my undergrad was first in science pre-med, how can people with no cognitive skills process noise as information, as music? What is happening in their brains that allows this sound in the environment, an environment that supposedly they don't understand or comprehend, to tell the brain that this is an old song that I heard 40, 50 years ago, and I know the words to it. I mean, where does that come from? So now fast forward 2 years, and I come to a nursing home in the Bronx called Beth Abraham, and there's a sort of asocial, I guess I could say that, shy neurologist who is just finishing his work on studying post-encephalitic Parkinson's. And he himself had seen firsthand how people with motor movement disorders who were very rigid and frozen could come to life in the moment when music was played to them. And I was fortunate enough to work with all those people when I started working there in 1980. So my first, I should say this, because my first communication with Dr. Sachs, Oliver, was a manila envelope that came in interoffice mail. And for those of you who know him, know this is very typical, with a torn off piece of loose leaf paper and a little scribbled note with a quote from Novalis: "Every disease is a musical problem, every cure a musical solution. Welcome, Ollie." And that started our journey back in 1980 of trying to figure out why our patients who seem to be so debilitated were not debilitated in the context of music and music engagement. And we actually went to a group of scientists back in the mid-'80s. There's a great neuroscience center at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and said, "Can you help us study music in the brain?" And they literally laughed. I mean, they said, "You can't study music. Music is a complex system. We can study beeps and we can study clicks. We can study little, cellular systems in a very specific area of the temporal cortex, but don't expect anything." And in fact, when I was doing my doctorate at NYU, I wanted to study neuroscience, and the professor there actually told me that I would be spending the next 5 years looking at rats, and it would actually have no translation into human function. So being in music therapy afforded me the ability to look at people in real time, in real responses to clinical uses of music therapy. The field of music therapy has been around now for over 60 years in the States, but you know yourself that the idea of music as a healing art has been around since the beginning of time, in every culture, in every society, from Plato to even before. We know that music has the ability to reach deeply into human emotion and human functioning in such a way that words can't do alone. And so people have been trying to harness this healing power of music for generations, and it's only been in the past 15 years that we've been able to look in the brain, these scientists, in real time to see how that is happening. In '84, when I was at Beth Abraham, the board of directors was looking at different clinical programs that were taking place and had invited me to talk about music therapy, and one of our board members, who's been the chair and one of the co-founders of the Institute, Eddie Stern, had said, "This is fabulous. We should be doing more of this. How can we do more?" And in fact, they helped Oliver and I start the Institute for Music and Neurologic Function back in the early 90s, really with the mission to become a conduit, a connection between the emerging cognitive neuroscience community and the field of music therapy so we can inform each other. And in fact, we've had many meetings over the years where neuroscientists and music therapists could get together in real time and share their knowledge as a way of pushing the field and the questions forward so we can really advance how we understand how the brain works and how we can use music as a better therapeutic tool to affect very deep functions. So I'm going to show you some examples of this. The first one, I'm sure you've all seen on YouTube because it's had over 1 million hits. And it's exactly that example that I was saying, how a person who seems to be so removed from reality and so disconnected comes to life when the piece of familiar music is played.
I'm looking more or less for religious music for him. Because he enjoys music and he always quoting the Bible. So I'd rather have that for him.
We first see Henry inert, maybe depressed, unresponsive, and almost unalive.
Henry.
Yeah?
Henry.
Yes, sir.
I found your music. You want your music now?
What do you want me?
Let's try your music, okay? And then you tell me if it's too loud or not.
Then he is given an iPod containing, we know, his favorite music. And immediately he lights up. His face assumes expression, his eyes open wide. He starts to sing and to rock and to move his arms, and he's being animated by the music.
And he used to always sit on the unit with his head like this. He didn't really talk to much people. And then when I introduced the music to him, this is his reaction ever since.
The philosopher Kant once called music the quickening art, and Henry is being quickened, he's being brought to life.
Yeah?
I'm going to take the music for 1 second, okay? Just to ask you a few questions. Okay? I'm going to give it back to you.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
The effect of this doesn't stop, because when the headphones are taken off, Henry, normally mute and virtually unable to answer the simplest yes or no questions, is quite voluble.
Henry,
Yeah?
do you like the iPod? Do you like the music you're hearing?
Yes?
Tell me about your music.
Well, I don't have one, I mean.
Do you like music?
Yeah, I'm crazy about music. You play beautiful music, beautiful sound.
Did
Beautiful.
Did you play music when you were, did you like music when you were young?
Yes, I went to big dances and things.
What was your favorite music when you were young?
Well, I guess, Cab Calloway was my #1 band guy I liked. They did the holy, the holly, the hilly, the holy, the milly, the holly, the ah.
What's your favorite?
So, pretty obvious, right? Music, sometimes people look at this and say, well, that's really nice, you know, he came to life, but is there any carryover? Does it mean anything? Oliver sometimes writes about, in fact, in Awakenings even talks about, I think it's a quote of T.S. Eliot, you are the music while the music lasts. And so historically, that's always been the question. Is this just a phenomena of the moment? The answer is that no, people change, and they change with increased exposure and experience with music. This is only scratching the surface. Here's a person who seems to be removed from his environment, who's minimally responsive unless somebody engages him. And that's where, when Ani was talking about music therapy being an interpersonal therapy, it really is, because it's not until the documentary person asked Henry a question that Henry is engaged now in a social interaction. Prior to that, he's locked in his response to his music. And you see the visual motor response, but you don't know, is he hearing it? How is he responding? What's going on in his mind? It's not until the person says, Do you like music? What does it remind you of? That all of a sudden the floods of memory come back. And in that engagement, we start to have a clue about who Henry is. And so music therapy and the use of music as a clinical tool, it's about that engagement of tweaking the surface, scratching the surface, and trying to reach down into where some of these residual networks are that are still functioning, or starting to become developed in a young child or in an older person who's losing some of those networks because of a neurologic disease like Alzheimer's disease or MS, or a traumatic brain injury. And we saw this so almost magically with Gabby Gifford's recovery after her traumatic injury, how she learned to speak for the first time through music before she was able to speak on her own. Another very dramatic example of using music as a therapeutic tool, and something that Ani and John Everson have been studying, is the motor aspect of music. How does rhythm and rhythmic pulse inform the initiation and control of our motor system? We saw it with the little infants. You saw immediate recognition of a melody and immediate motor responses of rocking, right? Well, what happens when a person has Parkinson's disease, which is where people have problems with initiation of movement? And can music help inform or stimulate the impulse to move, or allow for somebody to move where they would be frozen otherwise? And in this clinical example, you'll see a person who has something called a bradykinesia, a very slow movement, and has a shuffling gait, and you'll see how one side seems to be a little bit stiffer than the other. And she reaches over to her care partner to help her to walk. But when the music starts, well, I'll let you watch it. Here you go. Yeah.
If you want to start probably facing the other way as you go.
Now, it really looks like that. In fact, dancing and Parkinson's is so therapeutic that the Mark Morris Dance Troupe has actually started a program of dancing for people with Parkinson's and movement disorders that's grown all over the country because specifically of this phenomena. So how does rhythm inform movement? Well, what we're learning through our connections with the neuroscience community is that the auditory system has connections to all these major areas in the brain, as well as these different networks that may be connected just slightly differently. So if one network is damaged because of a stroke or head trauma or whatever, there's many other networks that can inform the same system. Dancing is like walking, but it originates differently, and it may recruit a different set of networks differently that allows the movement to take place. When we're learning are things that, like the auditory system has connections, rich connections to basal ganglia, a part of the brain that's very much involved in motor function and motor initiation. Some exciting research out of the field of music improvisation that really supports what happens in music therapy. So much of our clinical work happens in the moment of this clinical musical exchange between therapist and client. And many times people tell us we can't study that phenomena because you can't control it. You can't do a double-blind study because it's really about that in-the-moment interaction. Well, Charles Lim, who's at Johns Hopkins, right? And NIH, right? He's been looking at musical improvisation and has showed us that some of the monitoring systems in the brain, like the frontal cortex that tells us what we're doing or helps us plan on what we're doing, and the amygdala, turn off in the moments of pure creative response. So when we engage a child with autism, or when we engage a person with Alzheimer's disease or a person with stroke in making music in real time, we're actually disengaging some of these inhibitory systems and allowing for free expression. And it's in that allowing for free expression that we see this recovery. Another area that we're working very closely with is with recovery of speech and communication following stroke. Annie's done a lot of work in this area too, of the parallels between music and language, but more importantly, how music and song and rhythmic structure and melody inform recovery of in people who seem to have lost the ability to communicate because of a stroke or traumatic brain injury. And even in our program right now, just in a couple of months, we've seen people with 7 to 8% improvement through the therapists who are doing the testing and are blinded to the types of interventions we're doing. So we know this happens. There's wonderful research in this area. So what you'll be hearing from a lot in the future is how neuroscience and music therapists are working together to really help advance the prescriptive and clinical applications of music to really aid a whole host of potential applications, from early child development and sensory integration to recovery of function, hopefully recovery of function for people with devastating diseases and trauma. Thank you.
Ami, could you pick up and talk a few minutes about the whole language-music connection, and
Sure.
and then anything else you want to?
Okay.
Any other neurons that are fired in your brain since you
Right.
sat down?
Right. Well, yeah, I'll pick up on something that Connie was saying. So, in our everyday life, music seems like a very specialized activity, right? I mean, somebody playing a musical instrument is obviously not confused with somebody doing something else. Music doesn't sound like other things. It's a very distinctive activity. It requires some training. Danielle is actually in a band, right, with Joe Ledoux that plays rock and roll with music. But the point is, neuroscience is finding that it's not that music, when you look at the brain, is in its own little box that is unconnected to other things that we do. Almost the opposite. If you just took all of the neuroimaging studies of music, Daniela was showing some imaging studies of areas that are activated when people do different things. If you looked at the areas that were activated by music and harmony, melody, rhythm, timbre, memory, emotion, you would see, and you overlaid them all, it would just look like a Christmas tree. I mean, so much of the brain is involved in different aspects of music, and each of those regions of the brain is not unique to music, it's also involved in other cognitive skills, and those networks between music and other domains overlap to a much larger degree than people had appreciated. The area that I'm particularly interested in is how much the networks of music and language overlap. And just briefly, a lot is the bottom line of a lot of work that I've done and other people's have done. And it's surprising in a way because music, again, is not confusable with language, but looking inside the brain, there's a lot more overlap in the processes involved. And in fact, the one connection that doesn't hold up, that seems very intuitive to people, is music and math. I mean, you always hear this, isn't music connected to math somehow? And actually, the brain science and the cognitive science doesn't really support much of a strong connection there. Music has a lot of connections to other things, movement, as we saw in that video, emotion, memory, as we heard about, language, but interestingly enough, not the folk wisdom that you hear about music and math. So anyway, and that has implications for therapy as well as basic science.
Do you have anything to pick up on? And
Yeah, what we continue hearing is about synchronization. And synchronization is a fundamental property of the brain. Neurons don't work in isolation, they work together. So for instance, when you retrieve a memory, it's not just in the amygdala or the hippocampus. The hippocampus actually is like a conductor that orchestrates numerous regions, and together they work and you retrieve a memory. And if they are unsynchronized, you don't retrieve it. That's how the brain actually works. What the brain wants is to identify irregularities in the environment and be able to predict. And if you think about it, this is exactly what music is giving. It provides these regularities, and then you're able to predict. And something more interesting to think about is what happens when two brains connect. So for instance, we are engaged in conversation, and what happens is that our brains are now synchronized if we understand each other. So your brain is getting synchronized with mine, and over time you can actually even predict what I'm going to say. And that's how babies learn. They look into other brains. So in a sense, music represents the ideal situation. It's like the heaven of what a brain wants to be.
Is there any, I know Oliver mentions this at one point in the book, that there's part of the brain, I think it's the basal ganglia, where he compares to a kind of noise generator, a constant, that there is a constant sound, I mean, not an identifiable sound, but one thinks about the fact that often one's humming a tune to oneself, then one wonders what it is. Often it's kind of psychologically revealing, like a dream. But is there any clinical way to identify or confirm the fact that sounds, not necessarily noise, and even melodies, or a melody is subconsciously playing in our brain? Because often when things become quiet, we suddenly hear something that we've known for a long time. Has there been any investigation in that?
You know, I'm just thinking about Penfield's original studies when he was doing epilepsy surgery, and he actually, and Oliver writes about this in Awakenings, I think, firsthand, where he actually put electrodes along the temporal cortex of his patients as he was operating, and if he triggered certain areas, people would hear, they would hear conversations of a party they had just been in, or they would hear music playing as if it were playing on the radio, live. So it's really sort of strange to think that our memories are stored in such alive and, you know, accurate, audible form someplace. But I think what Daniela was saying that's really important is that how the brain forms memories through these, you know, stimulations and silences and, you know, the temporal patternings, so to speak, of neurons speaking to each other. That music is also a temporally structured phenomena. It's sound and no sound that has a pulse to it, and it's almost like it's perfect brain food, like you said, because it parallels how the brain learns on its own. The brain is nothing but rhythms. Think about EEG. Think about the human body, how the, you know, heart rhythms inform or stimulate EEG, or vice versa.
It sounds to me like like riffs. That they're musical riffs we have inventories of somewhere, and that often we can.
Yeah, so if we have this outside, if
click
we have
into.
this stimulus that not only enhances or is salient to brain function, but also carries information with it. I mean, you have the perfect, for us, the perfect therapeutic tool, because we can arouse these networks that may be dormant.
Right.
You know, evoking memories that are stored someplace back there that the person doesn't have access to. And then by awakening in these lower brain areas, if we can excite them, it's almost, I give the example often of somebody having a Jaguar, a really nice car in their garage that's been sitting there for a couple of years. You just inherited from your grandmother or grandfather or something. And everything's supposed to work. I mean, it's all connected, the wires are all there, but you put the key in and it doesn't start, right? But then you take a, you know, jumper cable and give it a little spark, works perfectly, right? So I often think of our brains as being like that we have all these dormant areas that maybe because of disease or because of, you know, inhibition or something like that have been blocked. And music gives us that spark to get it going.
So I'd like to open up the floor now. Where's the microphone? Or do we have a microphone? Up here. So the light is kind of poor. There's a questioner here on the front row, and then there's one in the back row, so maybe if the microphone can come here first. Could you tell us your name and anything else before you?
Sure. My name is Dorina, and I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania. And thinking about my own dissertation, I sort of had a two-part question. I would like to work with older adults who have acquired brain injury. And then designing my dissertation work, I wanted to know the difference between recorded music and live music from your perspective, Dr. Tomino, from musical therapy perspective, and perhaps the difference in the neural pathways between the two methods from Dr. Patel's perspective.
Very important. We talked about it before, and it's certainly on my
That's
list of questions.
You know, we were just talking about this because it's an area that really needs to be studied more carefully. Because we do see, especially that study that came out of Finland, that these very dramatic changes in psychological tests and people just listening to music, so we know it has a therapeutic benefit. But then if you add on the interpersonal and live interaction, you know how much, when music therapists work, they're really tweaking the music in real time. So if I'm working with somebody who is unable to initiate a word, for example, I may tweak the tone in such a way that informs the sound of the word. So I'm really playing around with that, which recorded music can't do. So we're already talking about the dynamic and interpersonal music making that's going to be different, but actually informs the brain differently too.
Any other responses to this?
So from a neuroscience point of view,
there was an interesting brain imaging study in which a colleague played participants contemporary music like Webern and Schoenberg, and they didn't know this sort of music, and he told half of them that this was composed by a computer, and he told the other half it was composed by a human being. And they all heard the same music, but they were thinking of it in different ways. And he saw very different brain activations depending on whether they thought it was a human or thought it was a computer. And there were areas of the brain called the theory of mind network, which is involved in imagining other people's thoughts and intentions, that were activated when they thought it was a human being, that were not activated when they thought it was a computer. Same music. And so I think the human brain is a social organ, and it wants to engage with the thoughts of others. And so I think when you provide a human being as opposed to a recorded device, I think you're going to activate a lot more of those brain networks and social things related to social cognition and social neuroscience. It was by Stefan Kolsch, Koelch, and it was, I can send it to you if you email.
Daniela, do you want to
something
respond?
I can briefly add from the perspective of memory. That's actually something I learned from a pianist called Nancy Garnier, who has a technique to combine music with
Nancy,
colors.
an old friend. Oh my God.
Yeah, she's an amazing musician.
Yeah.
So one thing about our memory is that we typically don't think about memories of sounds. So for example, this room, you know, if we're quiet for a second, it has a sound, right? So the house you grew up in or a particular situation, there's also a sound to it. And when we retrieve a memory, maybe this is the unconscious part, the music resonates in it. So maybe what the music is doing, we're not listening only to the tones, what we hear is the overtones.
Place.
Which are
Hearing the place.
Yeah, so if they're in the room and there are these overtones, the unconscious part of music, this captures the same overtones and sounds that we have in our memory, and that's completely unconscious.
There's another discipline that's really grown up called the sociology of music. Some people are doing some brilliant stuff there, and when you analyze what music people have heard lately and how much they've listened to, it's almost completely recorded music. We're now in a recorded music world. Live music is the exception in the extreme, and there has not been a lot of study of how those two things work. A clinical environment where Connie is eye to eye with the patient versus ambient music. Obviously, there's an enormous amount of flexibility and customization. But the whole question of ambient music, and is it only music, and how you get a sense of musicality through ambience. Most of our kids get their music ambiently, and they can refine their sense of musicality, learn about closure, and learn about dissonance and consonance and rhythms that way. So ambient music, which is a particular interest of mine, there's almost no one who studies how to design environments, particularly for cognitively disabled people, where you can add sounds like music that in fact begin to develop known things that then can be loaded with meaning and reloaded with meaning like memories. And used for that purpose.
I just want to add, Jeff, that there have been studies in music therapy, especially in cancer treatment and pain, perception of pain with tape music versus live music. But these were done back in the 80s. I mean, so it's the history of this kind of research is old, but being able to do large studies that could make it into a journal these days.
Oh, that's
that have
great. I told you I was going to learn something today. Did I not say I was going to learn something today? The question up at the top there.
Yeah, hi. Hi, my name is Marissa.
Marissa?
And I'm just a person very interested in all of this.
I didn't hear that.
I'm a person.
I'm a person.
Okay.
So I'm very curious about what has been looked into as far as the distinction between rhythm and harmony and melody. And so, for example, in that wonderful video of the woman reacting to the rhythm and starting to move. I'm just kind of interested in how much of that would have happened if the rhythm were specifically isolated, and what parts of the brain are affected.
There have been quite a few studies, and it's just the rhythm itself that informs the movement, and that works as an entrainment. There's a whole science of entrainment, of auditory entrainment systems that actually inform motor timing in humans. And the interesting thing is that melody helps the person internalize the beat. So if you can imagine, if you just heard a metronome beat, you would walk in time with that music. It's very hard to walk out of time. However, if the metronome was taken away, you would be and you had difficulty walking, you would be very, very hard to generate just a beat in time in the regular sense. But you can sing a song. And if you sing a song to yourself, you generate the same rhythm, because it's very hard for us to change the timing of a song we know very well. And there's been studies about that too. Our actual rhythm memory, or even pitch memory of recall is really close. So if you know, like Grateful Dead or something like that, you probably sing this song in the same key and the same pitch and same rhythm and tempi that the song originally was done. So for motor function, that's just rhythm in and of itself. For speech, it's both tone, inflection, and rhythm. And our speech is actually both. In fact, we're heavily reliant on motor timing in speech, which we're finding in our clinical studies. For memory, for eliciting recall memory in people with dementia, it's the song itself. Because of all the things Danielle is talking about, those lifelong historical memories and feelings that have been now associated with our wedding song, or the song we sang to the kids, every night as a lullaby. So music therapists have been taught to tweak different components of music so they could really apply it therapeutically to address very specific clinical goals.
And is there something looked into as far as the effect of like a minor sixth versus a major third versus on kind of the body?
There's been some things on reactions to those. In fact, one of the scientists at Einstein years ago had written, just looking at cellular response in the temporal lobe of how long neurons fire with a dissonant sound and a consonant sound. This was Jan Fishman's work. And sure enough, when you have a major third, something that's very harmonic, the neurons actually fire for a longer time. And when it's dissonant, they actually turn off very quickly. So, like you said, our brains are wired for music. I mean, even the sensitivity of whether we pay attention to it, or if it's noxious, we turn it off. So that's years ago. Jan's.
Any more reactions to Marissa to add? No? Okay.
I would like to say something, yes. Is there any way to connect to the music, and the fact that I no longer can read due to a glioblastoma, but I can sing, I can hear all the tunes, I can sing. I can no longer read words. Is there anything except that you can?
It depends on, can you see the words? Can you see letters?
Yes.
You just don't, you can't read what the meaning is. Process.
But I can sing.
When, it depends, it depends on where the damage is and whether we can associate, like if you were to sing lyrics to songs and follow the word as you were singing it, if over time that would restore or help you. But there's so many complex reasons why people lose ability. It's really working with you and finding out where the connections may be to restore that, if possible.
Great.
We know that, the brain changes, right? So it depends on.
Yeah, this gentleman has the microphone. Maybe we can hand it to you after he.
All right.
What's your name?
My name's Jesse Elder, and my profession is that of a jazz pianist. So this is very fascinating to be here. I stopped in here by accident, and my friend from Interlochen is working here, so I decided I got to check this out.
Well, music takes you over spontaneously.
Yeah.
So
I'm on my way to a concert, and I happen to have an extra hour and a half, so here I am. Amazing. And I have a lot of, my mind's going and going here listening to all this, but what Connie was saying about music and helping people with dementia and Alzheimer's, I've done a lot of playing in old people's homes, and it's amazing to see people who don't remember anything. They're almost just like vegetables, you start playing a song they know and they're singing every lyric. And if people can get up and dance, they start dancing with each other, they grab a partner, and it's really beautiful. And it's something I wish that the younger music community would get involved in more often, because there's a lot of therapy to be experienced. There's just a lot of potential right there. Makes me want to do some more volunteer work there. Also, what I was thinking about in terms of music in the brain is I do a lot of composing, and it's become my very favorite activity of my life. I sit down and I start writing, and I have an empty mind as to what is going to happen, and all of this, I have no idea what's happening with my brain. I'd be very interested in finding out more about it, but it just starts informing all of my decisions, which don't even feel like my own, and it's eventually you open up a current of thought that it's unlimited creative energy. It just keeps on going and going and building upon itself, and it's just a very fascinating world that I feel lucky to be involved in. And if you ever want to hook me up to a brain scanner while I'm writing, I'll volunteer, because I'm very fascinated by that. And then another thing about live music, I perform a lot with different bands. One band I'm in, work together 3, 4, 5 nights a week. It's a 5-piece jazz band, so there's a lot of improvisation involved. But we've been together for 3 years, so the amount of connection of minds that we have, I know how they're feeling, what kind of day they've had. I know what they're going to be playing. The synergy is amazing, and the way that feeds the audience, the way the audience hooks up with that energy current is unbelievable. That's one of my favorite reasons to. Yeah. So I could go on and on, but next person. Yes. Thank you for having this conversation.
Sure. The ancient Greeks would just simply say that you're a rhapsode, and it's all coming from the gods anyway. So last question, I think. Maybe one more.
Hi,
Renee?
can you hear me?
All of the panelists a very quick question, which is, could you please answer for me, where does music come from?
So we're going into metaphysics, guys. Danielle?
Go ahead.
Danielle?
Well, let me tell you a funny story, because and try to make it short. I was talking to a neuroscientist who said, when we were single cells, we didn't have to communicate outside of us. As soon as there were 2 cells, there had to be some form of communication, right? And that communication was either electrical or chemical. Fast forward to the human body, which is an amalgamation of numerous cells in one being, and then all of a sudden there's another human body next to us that we need to communicate to and communicate with. And how does that happen? It happens through sound. Right? And initially it happened because we had to scream help, or we had to alert somebody of something. And that need for communication, possibly, was the origination of music as well. Because obviously the communication was nonverbal.
Well, that talks about the need for it. It doesn't necessarily talk about
well, that's where
what emanates
music,
it,
but at least where human use of music came from.
Daniela?
I wanted to add something that is actually related to the last 3 questions. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that's the region here. This is the executive function region. This is what you use to control, to organize, to synchronize things. The medial prefrontal cortex is more involved. Actually, when people studied improvisation in the MRI scanner, they saw that you have to shut down your executive function region and to operate through the medial prefrontal cortex. So perhaps you can sing, but not read, because you're using these 2 systems, and when you improvise, you don't interfere yourself, so it's like something else is taking over. So the answer would be that the music comes from the brain when you let it do its thing.
Maybe we... I'll be brief. I'll just say you're an excellent company asking that question. Darwin wondered about the same thing.
Yep.
And there's been no end of armchair speculation about where it came from. What's interesting, what's happening today is it's actually becoming somewhat empirical science, because if music really came from some fundamentally ancient and deep brain circuits in our brains, you'd expect to see responses to music in other species, because evolution teaches us that the oldest and most fundamental aspects of our brain function are shared with other species. So there's actually now empirical studies looking to what extent other species respond to music using behavior and neuroscience tools, so keep an eye on that.
Yep.
Birds.
One more?
Okay.
She says stop panel.
I would say that we've been talking about music as an isolated human activity. And I think that in our culture, it actually relatively is, so that we think of ourselves as a culture in which we love music playing all the time, we walk around with iPods all the time, but relatively few people actually perform routinely for each other. If you ask a group of non-musicians how many of you have taken lessons, how many of you continue to play, relatively few do, and it's gotten actually less and less over the years. And I'm wondering if in an epidemiological way, you've studied or thought of studying what I would think of as kind of more true musical cultures, that is to say tribal cultures in certain countries in Africa in which singing and dancing is a part of everyday life and every village celebration involves song and dance related to those events in which people don't think of not singing. No one says, oh, I don't sing well, or I sing well.
There's a whole field of ethnomusicology that looks specifically at that. Dave Huron, Huro, is brilliant and has published many, just on the whole phenomena of communal music making.
So what I was wondering is, in terms of neuroscience, could we think of comparing those brains and those responses in cultures like that?
That's a wonderful idea. It hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, there's an ethnomusicologist, there's a music therapist who works with Gary Anstow, the woman down in South Africa.
That's right.
She and other music therapists went to help AIDS workers in South Africa, just gave them support with music. And it turned out that the women who help AIDS patients use it were so musical, constantly, way more than what a Western trained music therapist could bring to them. That basically the music therapists here had more to learn from just observing these women walking, working, singing, dealing than the therapist could actually give them. So it's an excellent perspective upon which to base this. So I can't read your, is it 3 more minutes?
Stop. It says stop.
Stop.
On cue.
Well, you know, I'm nearsighted, so very good, very good. Well, stop is the order of the day. This is